In the second half of the 19th century, the European nations, and also the United States even earlier, worked hard to create a society in which everybody more or less was speaking the same language and had the same sort of historical background, worshipped the same historical heroes. And in France, in the 1880s, they established a primary educational system which everybody was to learn French throughout France, because there are large parts of France that did not speak French or good French at that time. In Spain, they had started earlier in the 1860s. They put in a law that everybody had to learn Castilian, because they felt that they should be parts of Spain, like the Catalonia and the Basques, that did not speak Castilian, should learn it in their schools. England was less, should I say, organized, but they did not believe that the Welsh should continue to learn Welsh in their schools. They paid the teachers better if they taught in English than if they taught in Welsh. In Germany, they were worried very much about the number of Poles that they had taken over in the 18th century who still spoke Polish, and they wanted to have them learn German and become Germanisieren was the policy that they were following. And in the United States, as we know in our history, that's the whole cost was the idea of the melting pot. You took everybody from all over particularly the European world, and turned them into good Americans. Now, why was this policy suddenly become so general? One simple thought is, of course, that they were worried about people within the society that would not be loyal in a war. The Germans were certainly worried about the Poles. The French were worried about the Alsatians. And the Spaniards were never sure that the Catalans would be loyal either. But that's a rather lesser important one, than I think that the whole sense is the result of the sort of the introduction of democracy and general equality of all people. If everybody is going to be equal, then they should also somehow be similar. An evidence of this, the first time that this occurred was during the French Revolution. And the head of the French Constitutional Church, which broke with Rome, Bishop Gregoire, was very concerned that everybody in France should know French. And he sent out a survey at the beginning of the Revolution, and he discovered that maybe there were only about 15% of the people in France who really spoke, had control of good French. They had other languages, or they had patois, or they had Languedoc, but they should all know French. Why? Well, partly because the laws were not all going to be in French, and they should be able to read them all. But there's something even more profound than that. It's because the language of the Enlightenment, of the Les Lumières, was French. And if you did not have the French, you were not being open to the Enlightenment, to the modern world. So there is a certain missionary spirit to this desire for a homogeneous society. You want to bring the lower people back up to the level of the top. Certainly the Germans felt that the Poles could improve if they became more like the Germans. And the Americans felt that everybody coming into the States would be certainly much a better citizen and a more cultured person if they all spoke English and were Americanized. Now, the one aspect of this is, of course, there were people who did not fit in, or who somehow were not. You could assimilate certain people, but certain people refused to be assimilated, or did not want to be assimilated, or did not fit into what they thought was ideal. This, the United States was very obvious the case. They did not give citizenship to the Chinese who came in at the end of the 19th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act, they did not fit in. So if you don't fit in to this homogeneous society, you get excluded from it. You're not part of it. You're not part of a citizen of it. The American, Native Americans were put in reservations. They were not part of the society. In Germany, they tried very hard to make the Poles German, but the Polish nobility, the Poles were Catholic. The people around them in German were Protestant. The priests worked very hard to keep them Polish. And in 1914, the German Empire passed a law, which had already been passed by some of its states, saying that nobody can be a German citizen unless his father was of German blood. So it became German blood determined whether you were a German citizen or not. You could be German blood outside Germany, living outside Germany, even for generations, you'd still be a German citizen. But Poles could never become German citizens, neither could Jews. Now, this meant, of course, that you were creating a society which, in which there were no really class conflicts because everybody was going to be the same in the culture and the same ideal. So it is a vertical society. The boundaries with other societies were vertical. Now, this had not always been the case in the 19th century. In fact, the earlier part of the 19th century, the social boundaries were much more horizontal. They're much more all across Europe. The nobility really felt that it was part of a general European nobility. The bourgeoisie felt loyal to the bourgeoisie and to the French ideals of the French Revolution. When working class organizations came along in the 1830s and 40s, they sort of an international sense of organization. And if you think of Marx at this time, Marx analyzed society as a conflict between social classes, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. And that's because it really reflected what the society was like in Europe at that time. Any nationalist movements around Mazzini were really considered brothers of other nationalist movements. They were not in conflict with them. They were in conflict with Metternich and the Holy Alliance. Now, so what you had to move somehow you had to move from this horizontal boundary organization to a vertical one, and to get to the end of the 19th century, the the workers' organizations continued to exist, and they existed. The Second International was founded in 1889. It organized all of the European working classes, presumably to be international, to object to wars that were carried on by the the higher classes. And what happened, though, in 1914, all of the socialist parties supported the wars of their countries. They gave up this idea of international peace and organization, and it's taken that the vertical boundaries had actually overcome the horizontal ones by 1914, at the time of the war. So let's explain how, try to understand how that took place. The standard explanation is that nationalism took over the power of the nation state, which is Hobsbawm would say in his book, or what's his name? I'm sorry, I'm blanking, but any case, never mind. Schaeffer, Boyd Schaeffer was the big historian of the United States. He was the secretary, he was the editor of the American Historical Review for many years. He wrote a big book on nationalism, and he explained exactly how the nation state had taken over and changed the working class from a horizontal, from a class, international class, to a loyal to the nation. It did it through the schools, it did it through social programs, it did it through everything, other things. Now, this is what I have some kind of doubt about, and that I'm going to have someone say it's obviously there's a lot of truth in that, but let's suggest something else. And that's going to take me back to the 18th century. In the 18th century, a change in the structure of the, the social commitment came to a fulfillment that had been going on for several centuries. Before the 18th century, in the 16th or 17th century, if you want to explain how society was held together and kept from being a war of everybody against everybody, it was because it was religious. It believed in church, and it believed in they had the fear of punishment after death. Thomas More in his Utopia makes this very clear. In Utopia, he says they could have any religion they wanted except for one thing. They could not have a religion that did not believe in life after death and punishment after death, because if you didn't have that kind of fear, society would fall apart and everybody would be involved in criminal activity. Now, by the 18th century, you've got two new ideas that have come forward to take over this place. One is quite an old idea. It goes back actually to ancient times and to the Renaissance, but it's the idea of what they called virtue, which meant commitment to the community. commitment to the society. You had to have virtue, and if you had commitment to the society, then this would hold the society together and make it a successful group. Rousseau is sort of the prophet of this in the 18th century. The other idea that came forward, and finally in the 18th century, was the idea, what Montesquieu called honor, and meant that you search for your own benefit and for your own advancement. And you got honor from the king for doing service to the state, and the king, by organizing his gifts of honor, would organize the state successfully. Now, that was really just limited sort of to the upper classes, but it changed, and it changed with Adam Smith when he said that the idea that what keeps society going successfully together is every man being out for searching for his own welfare. There's an invisible hand that makes sure there's no king to do it, but there's an invisible hand to make sure that that benefits society as a whole. So you have these two ideals, the commitment to the community and commitment to the individual. And if you think of our society today, you still know this is still a central issue of our politics today, is which kind of commitment do you think is most important for the welfare of the society, of the country. Now, this continued, these two, in other words, these two motivations, self-interest and social commitment, continue through the 19th century and on into our time. And by the end of the 19th century, the individualism, as we'd call it, of individual commitment is very powerful throughout Western society. It's very powerful in this country. Everybody knows that it is. You think of Frederick Jackson Turner's picture of the immigrant getting off the boat and getting on a canoe and going to the frontier, and suddenly he becomes an individual looking for his own self-gain. And so everybody thought of the Americans as being particularly committed to individual self-gain. But it's not only the individuals. In England, the bestseller of the 60s and 70s was a little book called Self-Help by Anne Samuel Smiles. It's a story of all these people who have started out as poor people and risen to the top. The idea of rising to the top, getting out of your social class and going up, is powerful. In France, it's the historian Ernest Lavis published a book about the shoemaker Grégoire. And it's a children's book. It's about Grégoire has progressed from being what his parents were, and he knows, and he says his children will progress from what he is, because we're all going up. So this sense of individual is powerful, and it means that in a society, you can't really have class conflicts as the basis of the society, because otherwise, as soon as you move out of your class, you'd be the enemy of your parents or your old friends. Now, that means, of course, that there were parts of the society that did not fit in, and what do you do about them? Now, the American South came up with an idea. We don't have to have just one homogeneous society. We can have two. We can have a black society and we can have a white society. And they both have all the features of a homogeneous society, and they can be living parallel to each other, and that will make it constitutional. It'll take care of the problem of these minorities that don't quite fit in. Of course, we know that doesn't actually work out that way in our history, but that was the idea that was put forward. And in fact, it was an idea that became rather general, not in the exact same sense as the Southern segregation society, but when the First World War ended and they were drawing up the peace treaties in at the end of the First World War, they had the countries that they knew had minorities in them, and they could not. The ideal, of course, was that everybody should have their own country, but they knew these people couldn't. So what did you do? You had minority treaties. Wilson was back behind the idea of the minority treaties that made the defeated nations sign, and all the new nations like Czechoslovakia sign, saying that they would give the rights to use their own language, their schools, and their own culture, and in a sense to be separate entities within the society to the minorities. That, in a way, was the solution that would make sense, but in the 20s and 30s, it kept going backwards. It did not flourish. The concept of the homogeneous society kept getting stronger and stronger. Eventually, as you know, the the Germans used the issue of the minorities in the in Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland as an excuse for saying we're not being treated properly. The Czechs had done their best to follow the minority treaty, although some of the countries like Poland had not. But the Germans used the excuse of the Sudetenland and the Munich crisis to come in and take over that part. So that, and then of course we know that the Holocaust was the whole idea of getting rid of non-conforming minorities. But it's not only there, because in the United States we applied it to the Japanese in the Second World War, the Japanese exclusion. They still the same sense that they do not fit in, so they have to be put someplace else because they will not be loyal. It's a danger to the country. And after the war, the Allies allowed the victorious countries that changed their new forms, the Poles, the Czechs, and others, to expel the Germans because they let them have this whole sense of a homogeneous society. It's quite okay. Get rid of all those Germans that you have. They send them to West Germany or send them to the new German Republic. So the sense of homogeneity, the ideal of the homogeneous society is very powerful toward the end of the Second World War, in the whole period then. Now, since the Second World War, the Western countries have sort of realized that there has been a great deal of injustice committed this way. I think the image of the Holocaust is particularly powerful in making people realize that they can't eliminate people within them. So there have been attempts by the various European countries and the United States to correct the evils that we had created through that ideal. And they've done it in various ways. Now, the United States, in its own way, first of all, it took on the question of the separate but equal. And in the court case of Brown versus the Board of Education, they ruled in I guess it's 1954, that segregation did not give equality. It was not a just system. It did not fit into the Constitution, and they overruled the Supreme Court ruling of 1896, which was called Plessy, which had ruled that it was constitutional. And we had then integration of the schools. It was carried out with the control of the Supreme Court through the 60s, rather slowly at times, but in any case, the sense that they would have everybody together. And in other words, what the Americans did was to take the ideal of the homogeneous society and say, we'll have to make it a fair society. We'll include everybody, but we'll have to include it fairly. You had one way of policies, you remember, was the creation of affirmative action to try and improve the position of the minorities that had not fitted in. But when it came to the Supreme Court, it came in the Supreme Court in the Berkeley case in 1976 in the University of Davis campus. They ruled that you can't have separate affirmative action that's targeted at individual groups because that is against the 14th Amendment, against the fact that everybody has to be treated equally. And in fact, there's nothing that stands between the individual and the nation, so that you cannot have a group in between that has some effect on it. We're still fighting that issue about affirmative action, but it's basically the United States has stuck to the idea that the society should be homogeneous, that it's the only way that it can be. It has to be done fairly. The French society also France has even been even more powerful than the United States in this sense. They never recognized the rights of their minority groups. In 1919, when they were setting up the minority treaties, the Bretons, who'd always wanted to protect their language, the Celtic language, appealed to Clemenceau and said, well, we should have a minority treaty in France that applies to us. And his response was, there are no minorities in France, that we do not need a treaty. So the victorious nations did not did not adopt the minority treaties. Now, and the French have stuck by that right to the present. They still, I've been working some with the Bretons. There's a little group called the International International Committee for the Defense of the Breton Language, and they have a branch in this country, and I'm one of the 3 members of it, I guess. But they're still fighting to try, and they have their own schools. They immerse their kids in Breton, but the French government will not give them any support. Breton can only be taught in France as a foreign language. And the socialists, the Mitterrand tried to get out of this in the 1880s. They had this idea that there's this thing called the droit à la différence, the right to be different. And he put it in, they said they should have the right to have their own language if they want. But the conservatives ever since then have voted against it, and the European Council has a decision that every member of the European Council should favor the cultures of the minorities within their society. And the French have refused to accept it. They say it's against the Constitution, because the Constitution of France says the language of France is French. And so we do not have any other language we have to support. Now, 2 countries have actually gone in a different direction. The most obvious one is Spain, because Spain, under Franco, was applied very strongly the sense of homogeneity. Spain, Franco did not allow any of these minority languages to be used officially or in education, or even tried to keep them from being able to publish in Catalan. But after Franco died in 1975, there was a transition which introduced the present democratic monarchy, and there it gave authority to these, what they call the communities, the comunidades, to have use their own language as an official language, and as long as it also includes Castilian, as includes Spanish, and control of the educational system. And that's what the Spanish monarchy is like right now. The Catalans have control over their own education. They have control over, I don't know, they don't have police. The Basques have control of their own police. The Catalans don't. And the people, the Gallegos that live north of Portugal, also can use their own language and have it as an official language. So they have given up on the concept of a homogeneous society in a sense of a desire for a more democratic system. 20 years later, the British did the same, more or less, with the Welsh. In the Welsh language law of 1998, they gave Wales the authority to have its own language as an official language, as there are 2 languages in Wales. In their schools, you have to know both of them, been an employee of the Welsh government, and they have their own school system. And they created the Parliament of Scotland, so that they broke with the idea of a homogeneous society. I think it's curious that the 2 countries that have stuck by the ideal of the homogeneous society are the ones that had revolutions at the end of the 18th century, that had constituted just a history of constitutional law that somehow is stuck in and makes them feel differently. The French, the British, and the Spaniards are much more open to change than the French and the Americans in that sense. So that brings us down to the present. I would just end, is there any solution? Well, what's obvious is that everybody likes to live in a society where everybody else is like the same, like them. They're kind of suspicious of people. There seems to be, what seems to come out of this history is that this is more or less a psychological thing. People like to have their own society. The Scots, they've got their parliament, but they want independence now. So do the Catalans. So where do you have, well, I don't know. One thing we've certainly been coming along very strongly in this country and in England, and to a certain extent, curiously also in Germany, is the idea of multiculturalism. We do not have, the culture of this country is not just the white European culture that would be the culture of the homogeneous society of the 19th century. It is a culture that includes the African Americans, it includes the Asian, because it includes the Latinos, I suppose. And so we have to have something bigger that includes everybody, and then you don't have to feel that these people around you are strangers. I haven't gone into the issue of women, which is also part of the whole thing. Where do women fit into the homogeneous society? That's a whole story on its own. But the women have come up, and it seems some of the feminist movements, particularly in France, has come up recently that women are not part of the same society as men. They are part of humanity. And both of them, they're 2 parts of society, of humanity. One part of it is male and the other part is female, but it's one group. And maybe that's the solution to get away from the concept of gender hostility. So that's a possibility too. In any case, those are what I can offer you for this story. Okay.
Thank you very much.